Okay, well, hello, everybody, and we're going to get started. Sorry for the brief delay in getting going here. I just wanted to make sure I emailed the PowerPoint slides for this week's class presentation to you, and so that you have it, and we're ready to go forward from here. A couple things before we get going here. I just wanted to sort of go over the remaining bit of the class schedule. The only part of this is the remainder of the class, with the exception of the last week. The last week we have really one major activity, that's the final exam, and we'll get close. When we get closer to that, I'll talk more about the final. Format's a little bit different, so I'll talk a bit more about that. It's not going to be hugely different, but it'll be a bit different. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start talking about Chapter 10, which deals with the last two market structures, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So we're still in this market structure piece where we're talking about the economics of business firms. We'll finish that up. If I don't, I'm sure I'm probably not going to get done with that today. Probably get through most of monopolistic competition, if not all. I don't think at all that I'll get through oligopoly. Then we'll cover the rest on Wednesday. Then I'll get into Chapter 11. And probably there's not very much to go into with regard to Chapter 11. It's a fairly lengthy chapter in terms of content, but I'm not going to cover every bit of it. And in fact, I included in the Brightspace module for this week some content relating to game theory, which really relates to Chapter 10, and also the regulation of natural monopolies. I think I'm going to skip the natural monopoly regulation piece, that which is specific to natural monopolies, mostly because as I was reading it over once again, there are some bits of this that I think are really missing in order for you to get the full picture of it, because I think the historical view of utility regulation, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about natural monopoly regulation, we're talking about the regulation of utilities. There are some historical pricing mechanisms that have been put in place that I think are important to know, that really drive and have driven the behavior and the conduct of these firms over time in their goal, like all other firms, to maximize profit. So I'm going to cut that bit out of Chapter 11, but we shouldn't lose any kind of detail there. Let me see, I think this is Chapter 12 and 13 of the next. And, and I forgot Chapter 16. And Chapter 16, I don't know that we'll get to Chapter 16. It's an interesting chapter, but we are not covering Chapter 14. So I know that I kind of made a big deal about moving some of the content from Chapter 4, which we had taken out. And I basically removed that because there was a lot going on in Chapter 4. A lot of it had to deal with the economics of financial markets, which, yes, it's a micro topic, but I don't really think it goes with the labor piece. And Chapter 14 was much more attuned to that. I think in the interest of time, we're just not going to have a chance to get through that. We had a snow day during the semester. We had a holiday during the semester. We had some time for exams. And I think as we go forward with these Attend Anywhere classes, it looks like everybody wants to do their exams in Brightspace. So maybe we'll be better attuned. And again, this is the first semester we've done this format of live Zoom. You can attend at home, you can attend anywhere, you can look at it later or whatever. So I think we're just sort of feeling our way through this. And obviously I would rather remove material than add material. I'm never going to bring new things in. But Chapter 14 we are going to not cover. Chapter 16 is an interesting chapter. We may not get to it. Chapters 12 and 13 are very important, however, and they deal with economics of externalities. And so that will then take us really to the last of the three actor groups that we will cover, because we talked a bit about the economics of households in their role as consumers. We talked about utility and marginal utility and all that. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to the piece of them as laborers. So that's unfortunately not going to happen. And we spent quite a lot of time talking about the economics of business firms, that second actor group. And then the third, we'll talk about where government fits in order to regulate the activities primarily of business, but not just business. It's not just business because it's also consumers who do fit under the bit of regulation. And regulation is an important piece. And it also sort of fits into Chapter 16 as well, which also deals with things like risk and insurance. And I think it's really interesting. And if I don't have time for it, it's not going to be any huge loss. But I definitely want to get to this, because I think it's really an important part of our modern view of economics, particularly this idea of sustainability that is so much on the minds of so many people today. Okay, so that's where we're going and where we are. Also, a couple of things. I know exam 3 was available last week, and I had a little bit of trouble getting it uploaded on Wednesday. It took me a few hours to get it done. I don't know what the issue was. I could see it, but when I went into your view, I couldn't see it. So hopefully that 4-hour delay, 3-hour delay, whatever it was not fatal. And if it was, let me know. We'll sort of deal with it, but I kind of doubt it. But anyway, it was available. It was available through last night. If you didn't take it for whatever reason and you want to make it up, send me an email, let me know, and we'll arrange a time that I can make that exam available once again for you so that you can take it. So that shouldn't be a problem to do as long as you get to get it done this week, and you should be fine in order to do that. Okay. Also, one other thing I sent to you last week was an extra credit project. That's optional. Excuse me. It's entirely up to you as to whether or not you want to do it. What it is it's a college-wide project that's done about once every, I guess, a couple of years. It sort of rotates among the various schools. We're in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's basically an assessment of student learning. It's basically it's an assessment of how well students are critically evaluating and absorbing the material. And it was presented to us sometime about a month ago as a project for the spring, and so I sent it out to you. You got about a week to do it. If you're going to do it, you've got until Thursday midnight, and just email me a copy as well as upload a version of that to the Microsoft link. It's Microsoft Forms, I want to say. Upload that document to there, and there's no grade. It won't impact your grade at all. The only thing we'll do is a pass-fail proposition. If you do it, you get 20 extra credit points on your final grade. That's 20 points out of 400, which is pretty good amount of credit. So, and it says on there 75 minutes, but that's the boilerplate form that was provided for us by the team that put this together. That assumes that we were going to take a class session where we're all sitting here, but obviously we're not all sitting here. So you can disregard that. If you get it done in 15 minutes, that's perfectly fine. Nobody's going to, nobody's timing it anyway, so it's no big deal. The only time frame is just to upload it. Excuse me, in time to get credit. My seasonal allergies are sort of hitting me once again, so bear with me as I sort of work through this. So if you do want to do that activity, feel free. There's really no right or wrong, but you do want to be as thorough as you can on it, and just write it as like a letter, and it can be as conversational as you like. I mean, I wouldn't make it overly informal. I mean, I wouldn't use a lot of slang or bad language or anything like that. But it's basically your advocacy for a particular position. By the way, that particular question about the soccer stadium has already been decided anyway, so it's not the point. The point that it's moot is not even the point at all. It's just that you would be advocating for or against the soccer stadium if you and what your point of view is and why. So that's all you're going to do there. Okay. So the only part of this we don't have is week 15, which is the last week. That's the final exam. So that would be the bit of it. Now remember, I want to make sure, and I'll probably say this a few more times, just because last semester we had sort of a class-wide freak out when I dropped the lowest grade on exam scores in one of my sections. I don't know what sort of a mass hysteria arose. But that's what dropping the lowest score means, is I zero out that score. So of the first 4 exams, the lowest one is dropped, or the computer drops. It just drops it. The final exam is not dropped because we're required to have some final activity. So it goes away, and so does the associated point totals that you would divide your final grade into. So if you missed an exam, let's say you missed exam 2, but you took all the other exams, then it's not a problem, really. I mean, we always encourage everybody to take all exams because there's no reason not to. You have nothing to lose necessarily. But if you missed one, it'll go away. It'll just be is not even counted. Okay, so bear in mind that's what's going to go on as we compute the final grade. Also, one thing about the extra credit activity, it'll show up. So if you look at Brightspace, you go under My Grades, click on the My Grades tab, and there'll be exam 1, exam 2, exam 3, exam 4. You'll have like a cumulative total out to the right, and then there'll be an extra column that'll say extra credit. That won't be there probably until I compute the final grades, which is going to be somewhere around April 25th, I think. That's Monday, and we have to get them in by, I think, the 26th, I believe. So it may be sooner or whatever, but you won't see that there. So if you do the final or that extra credit activity, maybe I'll do it before then. But I probably won't. So all I'm saying is, don't freak out if you don't see that yet, because I'm writing down everybody who's presented that or done that extra credit activity. So it'll be there. Don't worry. If it's not there by the end of the day, Monday, then you can start to worry and get with me. But it will be there. Okay. So questions for me about anything that we have talked about so far? I just wanted to give sort of a rundown as to where we are and where we're going. So we're dropping chapter 14, which is a labor economics piece, but we've talked quite a lot about wages and workers in their roles, or households in their roles, workers and whatnot. So we have gotten to quite a lot of that. What we're going to do today is we're going to start talking about chapter 10, which is really sort of a continuation of chapter 8, chapter 9. Remember that when we talk about market structure, and you probably have this somewhere in your notes if you've been following along these discussions, we've got 4 market structures, plural. Let's spell that right, market structures. And the first of these was perfect competition. And we talked about all the manifest characteristics of perfect competition and the difficulties that firms find themselves in. And then we said that we've got a complete, almost polar opposite case, and that's monopoly, where with the exception of profit maximizing, which is the goal and the objective of every firm in all industries, with the exception of that profit maximizing objective, almost every characteristic of perfect competition you can flip around on its head and describe monopoly, where you have lots of competitors, ease of entry and exit. You've got one competitor or one super dominant competitor with high barriers to entry, high barriers to exit, and that's really the story of monopoly. So we describe this as North Pole, South Pole, or however sort of, negative pole, negative positive, however you want to view it as being binary opposites. But then we have what we're going to talk about today, which is a seeming contradiction. I've talked a little bit about the idea there is a seeming contradiction, because we've got a hybrid of both of these that I'm going to talk about today. That's called monopolistic competition. Now, monopolistic competition is a hybrid of both of those, which sounds oxymoronic, because how do you have 2 polar opposites and yet have a melding of both of those? What does that look like? It's like that movie Basketball, right? You're trying to put basketball and baseball together, right? Well, it is actually possible. The big issue is time frame. And you can have firms that earn what are substantially monopoly profits or close to it, or have such a dominant role in the market, despite competition, and sometimes lots of competition, but a dominant role in the market where they can command high prices. And we'll talk about that. And we said that the form of the good is not a big deal here with monopoly, because it's the barriers to entry that are really the issue. And in fact, we described the 2 historical examples of monopolies that I went over were Standard Oil, which was a commoditized product. Oil was oil, basically, and Microsoft, which is a very sort of customized product, and that you can actually do a lot of things with and has lots of different uses and whatnot. But it didn't really make any difference. The form of the product was not the issue with monopoly. It is with monopolistic competition. In fact, the form of the product is almost everything when it comes to this. It certainly is with this, because it has, the form of the product is bland. It's green beans in a big bin that you sort of put in a plastic bag. It's tomatoes, it's coal, it's timber, it's all the same. If you're going to buy lumber at Home Depot, you don't really care where the lumber came from. Did it come from Oregon? Who cares, right? Or did it come from Georgia? It doesn't matter, right? But here you do care, because these are things that you latch onto. I say you as a consumer, you and me and everybody as consumers, because we really do care about the brands that we buy. We care about what kind of beverages we prefer, the cigarettes we smoke, if we smoke, the shampoo we use, all those kinds of things. So that becomes a big deal. And then we have one that's sort of unusual, but sort of stands apart, and that's oligopoly. It's probably most interesting of all, in the sense that it's very common. We will all know all of these industries, that is, these market environments that oligopolistic industries take the form of. And we'll also know some of the big firms, because we're talking about big business here. And it's such a big capital intensive business that really small players don't exist. There are lots of small players here. And in fact, we said there are lots of small players in Monopoly. Even given the fact that we said that they're global monopolies, worldwide monopolies are pretty rare. But you might have a single tire store in a small town where the nearest town is 30 miles away. If you have a flat tire, you're probably not going to somehow get 30 miles away to get a new tire. You're probably going to buy it at the local tire store where that is essentially your monopoly, right? Or the only veterinarian in a remote area, the only large animal veterinarian. We have sort of monopoly. I know that my family were farmers and they had a sick cow or whatever. There was only one large animal veterinarian, and he pretty much came when he felt like it, and he charged what he felt like. And so you kind of get the idea, it's sort of monopoly. So you can be small here, definitely small here, and even somewhat small here, but not really. But here, that small business does not fit and play a role here at all, really, for reasons that we will talk about. Okay, and we'll talk about why this small business just does not really fit. I mean, it doesn't really fit here either so much, but it's theoretically possible that you can be monopolistically competitive. I mean, I guess it's not unreasonable at all, but you don't really think about small businesses fitting into category 3, definitely not in category 4. Okay, so as you can see, some of these categories, some of the characteristics sort of match each other, some don't. So there's overlap going on here. The only two that are really polar opposites are these guys here. And so, but these last 3 taken together are, and I've said this before, so you probably have this somewhere in your notes, are identified by what they're not, and that is they're imperfectly competitive. In other words, they form the, they're known by what they are not collectively, and what they're not collectively is they're not perfectly competitive. That is, there's something which impedes the free entry and exit of firms, the free up and down movement of prices, and also it creates generally economic profit, particularly in the short run. And in some cases, in the long run as well, economic profit can be created. So it really just depends upon the type of market that we're talking about. So the first one we want to talk about is monopolistic competition. So let's talk about that. I emailed the PowerPoint package to everybody about just right about 1:30, right about class starting time. So it's labeled microeconomics week 12. So you can take a look at that and sort of follow along. Again, the PowerPoints are probably most useful in order to sort of follow along with what I'm talking about here in class, okay? Okay, so monopolistic competition is defined as a structure that's called a hybrid of both perfect competition and monopolies. We talked about that. Let's talk about what some of the characteristics are of monopolistic competition. What are we talking about here with regard to monopolistic competition? And I'll go back to the board here in a minute, but I'd rather just sort of discuss some of these individually first, and then we'll get into some of the graphs, which one of the good things about monopolistic competition is it's not heavy into the graphs. It's not heavy into the math piece of it. So if that's good news to you, then you'll like that. And I guess really the same is true a little bit with oligopoly as well. As we get into chapter 11, we'll get into a bit of mathematics with regards to how we measure market power. That is market power on the part of firms, because we're talking about the economics of firms here. So we talk about what are the characteristics. Number one, many sellers exist in the market. So again, we're talking about a hybrid of both perfect competition and monopolies. So these characteristics are going to sort of weave their way in and out between characteristics that are indicative of perfect competition and emblematic of that, and those characteristics which are most emblematic of monopoly. So many sellers existing in the market is an example of this. And when we get into some of the examples of industries and firms within those industries, you'll see how there are many firms and why they exist. And in a lot of ways, for those of you who are studying marketing or who want to study marketing, these principles of monopolistic competition tie very closely into marketing principles and concepts. And I admit to not being a marketing person, so my marketing knowledge is somewhat limited, only to my own business experience. But I was never a pure marketer. I was more of a financial guy. But these will definitely tie into some of those relationships. Okay, so many sellers, excuse me, many sellers exist in the market. So, and we're going to see that. So it's right now that sounds a lot like perfect competition, as does the second one. There's relative ease of entry and exit. In other words, low barriers. Excuse me. I'm not sick. I'm just sort of, having a little trouble with my allergies. I don't think they're under control with the medication that I'm taking, unfortunately. So there's relative ease of entry. In other words, there are low barriers. It's relatively easy to get into these particular industries, and relatively easy to get out of. When I say ease, I'm not saying it's simple. And in fact, it's not quite as easy as it is in perfect competition, because the players in perfect competition almost have very, very low capital requirements usually. Now, you could argue that farmers do not have low capital requirements, particularly in the modern farming era, where you've got very, very expensive equipment. But for a lot of other industries, whether it's things like dog grooming or something like I guess tax preparation, maybe something like that, the capital requirements are relatively minimal, and they are here as well. So in terms of barriers to entry, they're not zero, but they're not that onerous. They're not that difficult to get into. Unlike Monopoly, where they're so difficult that they're insurmountable, which really explains the Monopoly's existence in the first place, is that they're really insurmountable. You just can't get into the industry because it's just too difficult to get into. And it's too difficult to start some really expensive businesses. An example that I mentioned was something like aerospace, which is not truly monopolistic in this country, but certainly it is in Europe, because Airbus is really the only game in town for the most part. And if they're not the only provider, they're big enough that they, kind of like Microsoft, they're not the only provider of operating systems, but they're big enough that they dominate and they sort of control the tempo and the form of how we use the product and the pricing and all that. And the software tends to be written to those particular standards, even though I realize that there are open source systems like Linux, and Apple has long had its own operating system and whatnot. Nonetheless, the monopoly power still, for the most part, it resides with Microsoft. That will probably change at some point. At some point, that will probably not be the case as we move into new realms of computing and whatnot. So these structures, these firms are never, there forever usually. And this is interesting too. In fact, I don't think I've really talked about this much, but I know Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, sort of made some press, particularly among those who don't follow the financial media very much, ordinary reporters, let's say. And I know it sounds like I'm always critical of mainstream press, and I'm not critical of the fact that it's often shows when they really don't have a background in business. And that's the idea. When Jeff Bezos said, Amazon one day is no longer going to exist. In other words, it's going to go out of business at some point. It's going to be bought by somebody, or it's going to fail, or it's going to get broken up. It's going to go away. It's going to be obsolete. And a lot of people are freaking out. What do you mean? Amazon's this great behemoth that started out in a garage, the great American success story. How can you, and if you've ever been to Seattle, it's like they've got all these locations everywhere. And so many people work for Amazon. So many people work for Amazon everywhere. How could you possibly say it's going to fail? And it goes against something that has been taught in accounting courses for generations, and that's the going concern principle. We assume the business will last forever. But in reality, businesses don't last forever. Now, there are businesses that have been around for so long, we don't know where the end point is. A company like Proctor Gamble, which has been around since the 1850s, before the Civil War, it's a pretty long time, about 6 or 7 generations back. We don't know where the end is, and it doesn't look like the end is anywhere near in sight. So in those limited cases where you've got these very old firms, yes, that's maybe the case. And in fact, there's beginning to be discussions within business schools about sort of toning down that going concern principle, because maybe it doesn't exist. These firms will all change over time, and they may not be what they are. In fact, monopolies are almost one of the reasons why they're rare on the global scene is because there's so much capital sloshing around the global economy that anybody who does have monopoly is really destined for competition at some point, which is why Bill Gates himself said, look, I'm as surprised as anybody that we became a monopoly. Okay, so in industries in which it's fairly easy to enter, that is, you don't have these insurmountable barriers to entry, like perfect. So we're in perfect competition and monopolistic competition. It's relatively easy to get in. You don't have these gigantic capital requirements. Unlike monopoly, and by the way, when we talk about natural monopoly, that really defines what a natural monopoly is. It's such a large market structure that any new competitor, all new competitor will do is incur the same tremendous costs of having a second water utility, a second power company, all those tremendous costs, and a sliced, already reduced market share, because now you're dividing it up with the existing competitor and nobody profits. So there's no incentive to have that. So as a result, regulation of that particular form of monopoly, which is tolerated and accepted, is the way that we move forward with having local monopolies. So when we say that global monopolies are somewhat rare, particularly given this fact that I mentioned earlier about global capital being so available. If you did have a monopoly on something, you'd find other competitors that, as a result, you have mostly local monopolies where it doesn't make sense for anybody to come in and compete. And by the way, even one of the examples that I gave of a monopoly, De Beers, the diamond syndicate, which we call it a syndicate because it's got related companies and downstream companies that do processing and distribution. Even there's now competition within the monopoly business. And so I would imagine that this discussion of De Beers is maybe even already a bit outdated in terms of an example of a monopoly. Because there are diamonds that are now mined in Canada, in Russia. I know Russia, it's problematic right now with Russia and the current situation, but you kind of get the idea. I don't know that we have diamonds in the US. I'm not an expert on that particular industry, but you kind of get that idea that that there are these monopolies are difficult. But monopolistic competition is one where it's easy to get into. Now, when I said the product is a big deal, I said it was kind of a big deal with perfect competition in the sense that there's really nothing to talk about. The goods are what they are. In monopoly, it's not a big deal. It's about the barriers. Monopolistic competition, this is the one where it's the good and the form of the good itself, which is everything, through what's known as product differentiation. These goods are highly differentiated. And as a result, these products are maybe the same, but they're so differentiated that the buyers, in other words, the demand side of the market, perceives a difference and is therefore willing to pay a higher price for that. That's what product differentiation is all about. Trying to make a product for which there's already competition, but for which you've got some sort of twist on the product, some sort of look, feel, taste, whatever, to the point where the demand side has a particular liking to that and a brand following. And so the next the next point on this is product differentiation is achieved through branding. So branding, if you're a marketing person, that is a big part of marketing, is branding. And what branding is all about. Branding is simply, well, we all know what brands are. They're all the things that we know and love when we go to the store to buy goods, right? And we oftentimes adhere to those particular brands. And what's most interesting is that as marketing studies have shown over time, and I may have mentioned this in a previous class, but there tends to be also, it's not universal, but there does tend to be a sort of intergenerational nature of brand loyalty. That is, if your parents, your mother, your father bought a particular brand of something, car or detergent or dishwashing liquid or whatever, that you're maybe probably more likely to buy it because you're familiar with it. You know what it does every time, and it does what it's supposed to do every single time. And that's what branding is all about. It's identical. It's the identical product every single time. And I'll talk a bit about why that's critical when it comes to the supply side of this. Even though we've been talking about the demand side here, we'll talk about what the supply side's role is in supporting that branding. And so the effort to maintain a brand is done through a lot of various management activities. The marketing management is really sort of a separate functional area within companies, particularly companies that make consumer goods. And when we talk about monopolistic competition, we are primarily talking about consumer goods. Not exclusively, but primarily, okay? Not exclusively. Okay, so when we talk about specific kinds of goods, even though some of these may not be consumer goods in the sense that there is an element of what we call B2B, that is business to business, and or B2G, business to government, even there could be even something like insurance, which is probably not one of the products you sort of expected to hear about in this discussion. That would be an example of monopolistic competition for the most part. And there, that's a very definite intergenerational thing, particularly if you bought car insurance or life insurance from a particular agent that maybe served your parents or whatever, and you like that agent, and the agents are very good at getting to know their clients. Usually, if they're good agents, they will, getting to know their clients and getting to know their clients' kids. And there's a reason for that. I know that when I was a kid, my parents had a life insurance agent who would send all of us kids a birthday card on our birthday. Which we always thought was kind of weird because we really didn't know him very well. But he knew our parents well, and I think he probably expected us to buy life insurance. I don't know that any of us ever did, but that's an idea, an effort to try to get this intergenerational nature of it going, and so that we would latch on to that particular brand of insurance. And so you get the idea. It's an effort at promotion. It's also good advertising. And advertising is really a separate realm in its own right. It falls under the sort of operational rubric of operational categorization of marketing, that is advertising. But advertising is a big, important part of it. And what's interesting too about advertising, and I know my dad was in the newspaper business for a lot of years and would always say that of advertising, of course, he was a newspaper man, so you expect him to be supportive of the idea of advertising. He would say that advertising doesn't cost, it pays. Those were his words. Advertising doesn't cost, it pays. That is, if you get word of mouth out there, you get yourself known, then it will pay back. And if it doesn't pay back, then don't do it. And in fact, we see that during slow economic times, when people are much more choosy and they choose inferior substitutes or choose not to buy certain products at all, that advertising expenditure goes way, way down. And I've also got a brother who just retired from the advertising industry, and he would talk about the fact that they'd be boom, boom, boom during good economic times, then bust during poor economic times, where some firms just simply wouldn't advertise at all. And in fact, if you think back to the last recession that we had, and I noticed this, and I didn't notice it until he pointed out to me, was that, and I'm not talking about the pandemic-related recession, but the one that started around the financial crisis of 08, 09, we just had this deluge of insurance company ads. And it was because of the fact that insurance rates or ad rates were coming down because demand for advertising. Remember, this was a recession. Businesses were suffering, especially in the financial sector. A lot of banks weren't advertising at all. You just didn't see any kind of bank advertising. And bankers were sort of laying low because, they were getting a lot of heat from everybody, from the government, from everybody. But insurance companies weren't really a part of that. And they just dominated the advertising. You had so many insurance company ads, the Geico Gecko and the Allstate insurance ads and Liberty Mutual. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And the Jake from State Farm. And they, to the point where almost every break in a program, you'd have at least one insurance company ad. I did not notice that. And it's not on every particular channel. If you watch some of the older oldies channels, you'll see a lot of ads for Medicare and dentures and things like that because of an older demographic. But advertising is targeted based upon those lines. But insurers were jumping in there because insurance is something you need, whether you are suffering a decline in hours at work or whatever. You still got to have car insurance and homeowners insurance. You still got to have it, and you're really don't shop around if you think you can get a better deal. And of course, they all advertise price, and they do so at their peril very often. But you kind of get the idea. So brand management really is a big effort to support these kinds of products. And for those who are interested in marketing and want to go on and study marketing in business school a little bit later, some of this will tie in directly to that. I'm not a marketing person, and this is about as far as economics gets into the marketing realm. And in fact, we as economists sort of have the idea that, particularly when it comes to the products and the sort of the psychological response of buyers, that the advertising industry probably knows more about what trips buyers' triggers than what we do as economists. That is one of the emotional triggers that cause buyers to latch on to brands. And why do they do what they do? but we know they do what they do because, I mean, even think about yourself, and I'm sort of probably as guilty of this as anybody, but when you go to a grocery store or to a Walmart or Target or whatever, you're picking up brands that you know, and because you've been there before, you know exactly what they do. Even though right next to it, there's a generic brand that goes for maybe even half of the price of the name brand good, but it doesn't make any difference. And that's an important issue as well as to why it doesn't make a difference. So we're buying Glad trash bags, even though they're much more expensive than the other. And by the way, I never buy the name brand trash bags because I figure they're trash bags, but you get the idea that people do. If people didn't do it, they wouldn't offer Glad and hefty trash bags and whatnot. But other brands we are very much attuned to. Look at during the pandemic, the tremendous rise in the sale of Clorox. And for those of you who remember going to grocery stores or to stores like Walmart or whatnot, where in the early stages of the pandemic, where everybody was bleaching everything, you almost couldn't find Clorox bleach. In fact, what you could find was maybe more of the generic bleach, and that would sell out after the Clorox would sell out, and the Clorox would be higher priced than the generic bleach. Like at Walmart, for instance, I know my wife and I, if we go to Walmart, we'll usually get it's in a green bottle. I don't know what the brand, sort of an off brand. Because I explained to her, and she would always buy Clorox. I said, don't buy Clorox, buy the other. Because what bleach is, and I didn't really realize this until I saw an interview with the CEO of Clorox, all it really is seawater, in other words, salt water, that they run electric charge through to change the electrical charge of it. So that is why bleach is so toxic. It's because it's got some weird charge, and so it basically kills everything organic. Viruses, bacteria, just zaps and bugs, whatever. Wipes them out, and which is why you shouldn't drink bleach. Unlike a recent president of ours suggested you might want to do. So that's what it is. And so and Clorox is located, I think, in Oakland, California. So they've got lots of seawater there, and that's all it really is. It's a very simple product. And so, but a lot of people will pay more for Clorox, and as a result, Clorox has done extremely well. I wish I had bought Clorox bleach stock in the early days of the pandemic. I think I probably would have done very well with it. I missed that trade. But supporting that brand is really what the supply side is big on doing. And then when we talk about pricing power, we're going to talk a bit about pricing power, particularly with regard to monopolistic competition and oligopoly, and how pricing power really does make a difference and really defines the degree to which firms in these industries can make economic profit. Remember, the goal of all business firms is to maximize profit, particularly economic profit, which includes the relevant opportunity costs of foregone opportunities. And by the way, I know I can't hear you, so I'm periodically looking over here to make sure that nobody's, hopefully if you do have questions, hopefully type something in the chat box. I'll be glad to respond if I see it there. Okay, so when it comes to pricing power, and I'm talking about pricing to the upside, obviously, since we're talking about the economics of firms here, it's in direct proportion with brand strength, i.e. the stronger the brand, the higher the price that can be commanded. So very strong brands have very high prices. And sometimes it maybe doesn't even have to do with the quality necessarily of the particular product. But brand strength makes a big difference. And it's interesting too, because I once saw a documentary, I mentioned Proctor Gamble a few minutes ago. So Procter Gamble is about 160, 70-year-old company based in Cincinnati that made its life starting out making candles. This is before oil lamps, before electricity and all that. And so in other words, household products. And they still really known for household products. They make Pampers. I don't know if they still sell Folgers. I think Jif peanut butter, I think, is one of their brands. But detergent is their big claim to fame. And if you go across the shelves in grocery stores, you'll see that you've got the strongest brand of all is Tide. Tide is the most dominant. It's the most expensive brand, I think, generally speaking. And you get lower brands like Cheer, which I believe is still made by Procter Gamble, All, and it goes down, and you have lesser quality brands at different prices. And they're all made by the same product, by the same company, Procter Gamble. A lot of these competing brands. So next time, if you're interested, just kind of flip those bottles around and see where they're made. Procter Gamble makes a lot of these. So the question is, okay, well, why would Procter Gamble sell? Why would they make products that sell at different prices? They're marketed differently, and in fact, the reality is that Procter Gamble's, and this is just, I picked this one company because it's a example. It's probably the best example I can think of as a pure consumer products company where that's the only thing they make is consumer products. They're not into software and electronics and aerospace. They're into consumer products. They have brand management where they're little companies. So you have a Tide, which is the Tide brand has a brand manager that runs that. They have their own budget, their own staff, their own, I think everything, their own IT and accounting and promotional staff, sales staff, everything. That's what their job is to sell the Tide name. And if they have to compete against the other products, they think that that makes their culture stronger when Cheers competing against Tide and whatnot, that they feel it makes it better. So it might seem like that they're cannibalizing their own customer base, but in reality they're not, because what they understand is not everybody's going to pay the highest price for the highest branded good. And we know Tide gets a lot of advertising, so it's an expensive product to market. I think they used to have a NASCAR, maybe still do, I don't know. There was a Tide car, I have no idea who the driver was. But lots of advertising, a little bit less advertising on some of the other brands. And I think there's the final brand, which I don't even know offhand, gets almost no, maybe it's Era, maybe, I don't even know, it gets very little, if any, product support at all in terms of marketing promotion, but certainly Tide does. And so, but not everyone's going to pay the higher price. So they're going to pay, so they're going to grab that part of the market that will pay the lower price, and that part of it will pay an even lower price. Knowing that markets are segmented, this is really an important aspect of it. Marketing people are make their living by deciding how to segment the market. This is very important because if you're not able to understand the demand side, and the demand side is not just a uniform group of people who have all the same characteristics. They differ on all kinds of different areas in terms of age, tastes and preferences, all these things which sort of make the shift in demand possible, right? Incomes, whether they can have substitutes, whether they would desire to have substitutes, whether they're particular candidates. And I mentioned age because there are some goods that are age appropriate and some are not, right? If you have no children, you're probably not going to buy Play-Doh. So what's the point of advertising Play-Doh on a show that older people will watch, like reruns of Andy Griffith, right? I'm not saying that younger people won't watch it, but you tend not to see toy ads on shows that are geared toward older people, or something like 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes is one of the most popular shows on TV. And if you see, it's got an older demographic too. So you see lots of Orajel ads and denture grip and all these things for older consumers. And you probably don't see any motorcycle ads or Bud Light ads or anything like that. That's a younger demographic, it's a younger. So you have to, age is a big differentiating factor. Income is a big differentiating factor. Gender is big too, because some goods males buy, some females buy, and some they have different preferences as well, in addition to certain needs. But also, it's also other things as well. It's whether you have children or not, you know, that sort of thing. So slicing and dicing the market is a big one. If you just take income would be a big determinant of these different levels of the shelf. And so it's a way to grab more market share by selling those products. It also explains generic products and why generics exist. And first of all, I have to ask this question: who makes the generic products that you see in the stores that are right next to the name brand goods themselves? It's most often the maker of the good itself that makes the generic product. Sometimes they don't even bother to change the address on the back of the label. It's the very same product, only one is sort of a no-name product and the other has the brand name. But they'll look almost identical, and in fact, they are pretty much the very same good. And in this day and age, whether it's a consumer product where we can understand what's exactly in the product because we can study things chemically to know exactly what that product is. You know, we pretty much know what the product itself is, and if it's off any kind of a patent, then it's fair game for anybody to copy that particular product. So everybody knows what Coke is. I mean, I know when I was a kid, there was this rumor that it was sort of an urban legend that the formula to Coca-Cola was in some bank vault somewhere, and that only a few people had access to that. So Coke was this big secret. Well, it's not a big secret because Pepsi has been around a long time too. And it's not quite the same product, but it's pretty darn close. So close that people in blind taste tests presented with a Dixie cup of Coke and a Dixie cup of Pepsi can't tell the difference apart. They just can't tell the difference apart. In fact, I think I may have mentioned this to the class, but when I was in graduate school, we were doing a bit on differentiation and pricing, where we did a bit of a study where if you were over 21, you got to sample a Dixie cup of Bud Light, Dixie cup of Miller Lite, and say which was which, and only about half got it right, which was about what you'd expect. It's a coin toss, and in other words, the other half were guessing, and maybe all were guessing, but half got it right. So the bottom line results were that nobody could really tell the difference. And I know when I tell that to expert beer drinkers, they deny that they can't tell the difference between Bud Light and Miller Lite. It's like, you've got to be crazy. Anybody can tell the difference. Not so. And nor can they tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi. And by the way, when it comes to brand and brand management, probably one of the biggest fiascos in brand management comes back to Coca-Cola itself. And that is when Coca-Cola, about 40 years ago almost, or something around there, had done a lot of studies. These very same blind studies that said, do you like this Dixie cup or this Dixie cup, not knowing what they were. It turns out people like the Pepsi a little bit better. A little bit better, is a little sweeter. I'm saying they're similar, they're not the same good. So Coke changed its product to New Coke. And the response on the part of the demand side was fierce, to the point where people were going to grocery stores and even saying, can you give me a pallet of, bring me on a forklift, bring me on a pallet of Coke before it goes away and I can't buy it ever again. And then Coke quickly brought out Coke Classic, which was the original brand that would sell side by side with Coke, the New Coke. The New Coke was quietly retired some time ago while Coke Classic went on. Now the Coke Classic name was retired very quietly, and then like it never happened in the first place. But it was really, really a silly decision because they were messing with the brand. And messing with the brand is a really important thing to avoid doing. A very important thing to avoid doing, because it really, everything about this structure hinges on the product itself and about how you maintain the particular differentiation. You can't differentiate a product if it itself is going to differ within itself. There was a story about Budweiser that was, or Anheuser-Busch, which is the maker of Budweiser, that was making a big batch of Budweiser in big vats and whatnot. And there was some quality issue that went on, and they decided they couldn't. It was a gigantic amount of beer that was going to go on for further processing. They decided they couldn't, so they just poured it all down the drain. And even though they thought, well, we could probably get away with it, but we don't want to mess with the brand by introducing this. We don't want people to think, hey, there's something a little bit different. They've changed Budweiser beer up because people know what they like what they know, even though they may not be able to tell Budweiser from some other kind of beer. It's still, if they perceive there's something a little bit different, and that's their entire claim to it, because basically beer is beer. I mean, I know that those are fighting words among people who are really big into craft beers. And I understand that. I don't drink beer myself, but I get it. I used to drink beer, but I do understand it. But when we talk about things like cola and Sprite and 7-Up are basically the same kind of product. A lot of these goods are basically the same. Folgers and Maxwell House are basically the same kind of product. Scott paper towels are pretty much the same as Bounty paper towels. I know they would make you believe they're a little bit different, and that Huggies and Loves are basically the same, even though they would have you believe that they're a little bit different. They're a little bit different, but not really. I mean, and so it's really about price, and it's about branding. And there are people who probably say, only buy me Huggies and don't buy me Love's diapers or whatever, and only buy me Bounty paper towels, and that's the only thing. And in fact, when we go to the store, we are like automatons. We'll pick Starkist tuna, Bounty paper towels, Folgers, like that, and then we'll go check out. Not even looking side by side at cheaper alternatives. That's a lot of the way consumers behave. And if you're in that particular groove where you're the seller, it's a great place to be. It's a great place to be because you've got this sort of automatic repetition buying, which is good, which is why a company like Procter Gamble feels no need to venture into some area that it doesn't feel like it's got any business venturing into. Kind of like the example that I gave a few weeks ago where I talked about the drug company Eli Lilly that one thing about pharmaceutical drugs is they've got very high margins, price here, average cost per unit down here. And so they thought, well, let's, in case, some of these drugs go off patent and we are good enough to put new drugs together. What are other high margin businesses? And they thought cosmetics, a really high margin business. Doesn't cost much to make cosmetics. So they got into that business, but it turns out that even though the price is here and the cost is here, they couldn't figure out how to do it. They didn't understand the customer is a different kind of customer. Didn't understand what to do, didn't understand how to manage it, how to manage the brand. They were drug people. So, and the trend really in the business world now, and this runs counter to what some of you might even still believe, but the trend is toward focusing on certain goods and not doing things which one does less well. Now, if you follow mostly the tech industry, you'll find that does not jive, because you see like companies like Microsoft even trying to get into some hardware and to things like server-side sorts of enterprise uses and things like that. And companies like Cisco, which were hardware companies, trying to get into things like software and other areas. In other words, trying to expand. That's really to sort of gain market share, to try to move ahead, because those products are really changing rapidly. But for the most part, though, particularly when it comes to consumer brands, you'll see companies that once had multiple business units doing different things, spinning those off into different companies. And that includes the drug industry, which has spun lots of goods off. AbbVie is a company that used to be part of Abbott Labs, and it was spun off as a separate company altogether. And we've seen this happen before, where companies that used to have multiple lines of business are sort of trying to focus, because it's easier to focus on doing fewer things and doing those much better than doing lots of things and maybe not doing those as well. And I know that I was talking about Scott Paper earlier. There was a guy who was brought in when Scott Paper was having lots of financial trouble. Back in, I think, the 80s, I want to say, there's a guy named Al Dunlap who was hired as CEO. And his nickname was Chainsaw Al. And so you can kind of guess what his MO was. But he basically slashed the number of individual SKUs. SKUs are individual products that have their own code that you scan. He cut those by like more than a half. And that way, cut lots of costs, closed plants, reduced the number of product offerings, and thereby boosted profitability. And the company sort of regained its financial footing, just simply by focusing, not doing a lot of things, but by doing more things right. Okay, or by doing fewer things but doing them better. Okay, so that's an example of that. So pricing power is in relation to all this. Starting the brand, and to relate this back to microeconomics, the stronger the brand, the steeper the demand curve, that is the more price inelastic will be. Having said that, one of the things that is in your book is the fact that the book talks about the idea that you've got a perfect competition. So this is perfect competition here, and this is monopoly here. And when we talk about the demand curve itself, we're saying the demand curve in perfect competition is flat like that, and in monopoly it's downward sloping like that. Well, then what is the hybrid of the two of those that come together in its monopolistic competition? And in monopolistic competition, the idea is you've got a relatively flat demand curve, like something like that, flatter. And that is true, particularly in the long run, because, and we'll get to the long run here in just a minute, before we wrap up this piece on monopolistic competition. And that is that in the short run, to the extent that the firm can steepen this demand curve, that is by selling mostly the same quantity, but at higher prices, that gives them pricing power. And that pricing power is achieved through leveraging brand strength. And once you've got brand strength, you can, in fact, sort of steepen this demand curve. Because remember, the advantage lies on the supply side when you've got a steep demand curve, inelastic. Inelastic means price insensitive. So people will pay the higher price for the good, despite the fact that it is essentially the same good as its substitutes. And there are lots of competitors. All the goods that I've sort of mentioned here, whether it's coffee or paper towels or diapers or whatever, there's all competition. There is no monopoly setup. The only reason we talk about the monopolistic part in the term monopolistic competition is the idea of monopoly-like pricing, and in particular, monopoly-like profits that are made. And that's really the essential aspect of what's going on here, is the pricing power is in relation to brand strength. So to the extent that a firm can then steepen this demand curve, right? In other words, trying to rotate this demand curve this way, this way, this way, rotating it in that direction, it's all to the good, right? So taking it from some D0 to D1, D2, D3, all that is a steepening of the demand curve, which is essentially what pricing power is all about. And we're going to get into the ramifications of pricing power. In chapter 11, we talk about, does a firm engage in pricing that is considered to be unfair to consumers, particularly if they're the only game in town as a monopoly, or even as an oligopoly, which is a few players where there are high barriers to entry. We'll talk about oligopoly a bit later. The form of the product is not a big deal in oligopoly so much either. But monopolistic competition, it's this idea of trying to get monopolistic pricing, which is essentially the goal. And the end goal here in monopolistic competition is to achieve something that looks like this. And we're saying that profitability is primarily a feature of the short run in monopolistic competition. So if you've got your standard PQ plane, these are all PQ planes here. I put dollar signs as opposed to the price, mostly because sometimes we're overlaying cost, and we're certainly going to be overlaying cost here with this. So if you've got here a relatively steep demand curve like this in monopolistic competition, right? You have a relatively steep demand curve, and you've got a marginal revenue curve, which is something like that, right? Same kind of deal. It's also steep as a result of this. You've got a marginal cost curve that's cutting in like here, right? Marginal cost. There's your marginal cost curve. And the profit maximizing firm, which I think is going to be on the next page, the very last item, but I will come back to this. You're going to still produce the quantity that maximizes profit. So again, a pi symbol represents profit, and you're going to charge the price that, well, I didn't draw the demand curve up high enough, didn't extend it high enough, but the price is going to be somewhere up here. Okay, so you're going to mark the price up because there is demand even at that limited level, so that is going to be the price of the good. Okay, that's going to be the price of the good at that particular price. And to the extent then that you've got this kind of thing going on, where you've got the average cost curve that comes in somewhere like this. I know your book leaves off the T, it just says average. It's the same thing. It's average total cost, average cost. It's quantity or total cost divided by quantity. What you've got going on is this entire shaded region where you've got, this is the quantity here, this is the price, and this is the cost. So all this region here is profit. Okay, all that shaded region is profit because it's the price above average cost. Remember, average cost is the price, whereas the cost of production per unit at that particular level of production, it's going to change because as you produce more, it's going to go up. As you start to get sort of mini diseconomies of scale in the very short run. So this is the monopolistic competition view, particularly in a very short run capacity, because we're going to say that these are mostly short run phenomena. But let's kind of back up here a little bit. And on the second page of these characteristics of monopolistic competition, it talks about the fact we have product protection through copyrights, patents, trademarks. We talked about that first in regard to monopoly, and it's probably even more important when it comes to monopolistic competition. The thing about patents is they will go away at some point. So for things like prescription drugs, I think it's 20 years. I think it used to be much shorter. I think it's been elongated. And drug companies probably were successful in getting Congress to change the law there so they can earn profits for longer, a little bit of a monopoly. So give us the monopoly pricing bit of it. There's no single drug company that's a monopoly. They all compete in monopolistic competition because they are different brands. And there is no one heart medication, blood pressure medication, cancer medicine for the most part. But there are medicines that do one particular thing and maybe one thing better than the others. And to the extent that they're still fairly new because these patents only last, and I think the clock starts ticking as soon as the drug is approved. So that is the clock on the patent, the life of the patent. So firms have got to get these products to market and advertise them. And that's why you see these drugs that you see advertised on television for whatever they are probably all under patent. And that's the only way they could support the advertising is the higher prices that they're getting. And really what they're trying to drive there is the idea that if you've got a particular condition, whatever it is, rosacea or asthma or whatever, I mean, you name the condition, that you'll go to your doctor and say, how does that drug work? And the doctor will say, oh, you want that drug? Let's try that drug. Okay, we'll do that. I think doctors could more or less care less, even though drug companies solicit them mercilessly for their business and whatnot. But nonetheless, I think they mostly care less. I should have drawn this past the quantity angle here. Probably extends to the quantity axis. But they'll market it very heavily. But for the most part, I don't think doctors really, in their heart of hearts, could care what you buy. But they are oftentimes marketed because because a lot of times buyers do not know. I think patients are more educated now than what they probably ever have been. And sometimes I think doctors would say that's maybe a good thing, maybe not such a good thing. I think my wife was badgering me to get some kind of shot for some kind of like meningitis or whatever. The teachers everywhere were getting those shots. And my doctor said, your odds of getting meningitis are not strong at all. So in fact, your odds of getting sick from the vaccine are worse than meningitis. Are worse than are better than getting meningitis, which is not to say all vaccines are bad. I certainly do not want to go on record saying that. But he may have been exaggerating a bit, but he advised against the meningitis shot, even though she probably saw something somewhere and whatnot. So you kind of get the idea. So copyrights, patents, trademarks. Trademarks, by the way, are interesting because trademarks are important in the sense that they go on, they've got to be renewed. So it's very important for the firm that owns those trademarks to renew them. Some of those have been around for a very long time and are very recognizable. I think we all know what the Coca-Cola logo is with a cursive signature or signing of the name. There's so many brands that are just recognizable just because of the trademark itself. The McDonald's arches, you can be anywhere in the world almost, and you'll find McDonald's arches. You know exactly what that is from half a mile away as soon as you see it. It's recognizable. And if you didn't see it and you wouldn't know what it was, and you might skip on by unless you really were looking hard for it. So you get the idea that those trademarks are very important. And oftentimes they'll trademark the reverse image as well, because some people have been known to make t-shirts out of the reverse image and sell those, and people like the particular logo and will buy that, and it's not covered under patent protection or trademark protection unless it is. And firms will defend these very aggressively. And that's one of the key points that I've made here is firms will go out of their way to defend those. Because why? Because remember, it's the form of the brand that defines the differentiation, which defines the pricing power. And it's the pricing power which leads to the ability to get economic profit. Remember, if it were supply and demand only, it would be down here, right? Where demand equals supplier, marginal cost, same thing. The price would be here. So it's this difference that to the degree to which brand strength is important, you can command a higher price. And so, so you have to defend the brand. And they go to great lengths. I know that if you go to a restaurant and you order a Coke and they don't sell Coke products, they will invariably say, is Pepsi okay? Because why? Coke has been known and Pepsi has been known to go around to restaurants, order that particular product. If they don't have it, they want to make sure Coke is not being represented as Pepsi and Pepsi is not being represented as Coke. The seller can get in some trouble for doing that. So as a result, they will pretty much always say that. I like a Coke. Is Pepsi okay? That sort of thing. So it is very common and standard practice. I know that when I was in college, there was a local ice cream store, family owned, been around forever. We had a product that had been around forever. It was called a Blizzard. It was just an ice cream product. And it had been around since like the 1920s. The only reason I know this is because they got sued by Dairy Queen when Dairy Queen came out with its product called the Blizzard. But they actually bothered to get that name trademarked, whereas this small company located in a small town, in a small college town, didn't, because they didn't think it was a big deal. Dairy Queen went to court to sue them and said, we own the name Blizzard. You cannot sell Blizzards because we own the name Blizzard. And so even though we had the name 60 years ago, it doesn't matter. So they had to change it. And so they agreed they would call it Blizzards with a T, and Dairy Queen would get to carry on its Blizzard name. And at the time, a lot of us, I think, probably being naive and not being aware of these things, wonder why was Dairy Queen, which was a global brand, coming down on this little mom and pop restaurant in a small college town. And they do it because they have to defend the brand. And in fact, there is, I've been told by lawyers that if a firm does not defend its brand, it's inherently giving up the ground to that particular brand, to some competitor, to usurp the name, to usurp the particular name. And so, and there have been cases in which brands and companies have gone out of business and they've taken their brands with them, but the brand has no longer support the brand of the trademark because the company doesn't exist. And somebody else has picked up that brand name and come up and started a brand new product. It's new and improved, it's different, and nobody would know the difference because they've got the image, the likeness, it's the very same product. And so as a result, they continue to go on. And so these defending the brand, and by the way, for those of you who are football fans, there's one football league in this country, really. I mean, I know there were efforts at starting a competing league a few years ago that didn't go so well. I think there's another sort of underway effort to get something new going there. But it's sort of a monopoly in some respects with 32 teams. And the commissioner of football has said that his main job is to defend the shield. And what he's basically the shield is their logo. And in other words, he's defending the brand. He's doing everything he can to defend the brand because that's what they have to sell. It's not really that unique of a product because somebody could theoretically create a rival football league if they so wanted to do so. And by the way, we at one time, even when I was younger, had two competing basketball leagues that were pretty competitive with one another. The old ABA, even though it was smaller market teams. I grew up in a smaller market city where we had a really good ABA team, and everybody was in the ABA team. We're not into the NBA teams at all. And then those teams eventually got folded into the NBA when that league went bust. But that's the example of branding. And a lot of things came from the ABA that were adopted by the NBA, like the three-point shot and all that good stuff. So you kind of get the idea. So defending the brand is an important thing. And by the way, back to this NFL thing, I had a client when I was in commercial lending who would a bar, it was like a pub, like a sports bar, and would show NFL Monday Night Football games on a big screen. And a big crowd come in and she would advertise and promote it, but she didn't have approval to do that. So if you've ever watched football where it says express written consent must be obtained by the National Football League to reproduce, or no part of this may be reproduced without the express written consent. In other words, you have to have their approval to do it for commercial purposes, to sell it. And she was sued by the NFL. The NFL was so aggressive, and the NFL's lawyers said, we are going to drive you out of business if you don't stop. We are going to sue you. We're just going to keep it up. The threats were real. Her lawyer said, just stop. You've got to stop. In fact, not only do you have to stop, you got to pay them for the what they would have earned for the NFL broadcasts that you did broadcast without their approval. And so it almost bankrupted her. So you get the idea. They are serious about defending the brand. If they don't defend the brand, they're implicitly giving approval for you to take over that brand. And so they have to do that, okay? Also, just to sort of wrap this up here, the negative price effect is definitely in play. We talked about this before, and if you have any additional questions about how that negative price effect works, you've got the two vectors, the output effect. Remember, total revenue is composed of two elements, price and quantity. And so you've got price and quantity multiplied by each other. As price, remember though, demand curve is price goes up, quantity goes down. So you get this vector pushing this way, this vector pushing this way. So the answer, and it's a dollar figure because everything in economics, where it's a number divided by or multiplied by a number, is always going to be a dollar figure. Does the price effect overwhelm the output effect to have a higher total revenue with a higher price? Or does the quantity effect, the output effect work? Because what if it goes down and this goes up? Then what? Well, we're going to see that it goes this direction. That if the price goes down, total revenue will go, specifically marginal revenue. It's marginal revenue, it's really because marginal revenue is composed of the change in total revenue divided by the change in the quantity and the change in this. So it's going to bring this down, which is why you've got a very steep marginal revenue curve. It's the negative price effect going on there. Okay. And then finally, short run profit is possible in short run. due to monopoly pricing. So we're going to say this is a short run model of monopolistic competition, and we'll talk more about the long run. So that's a pretty good place to stop, is right there, and we're out of time in any case. So I'll pick that up, and we'll finish this up on Wednesday, talking about some examples that I haven't already talked about in class today. Then we'll get into oligopoly and talk about that. And we probably should be mostly through oligopoly. So we're really right on track with where we ought to be. So are there questions for me about anything? I don't see anything in the chat box. Okay, well, I'll say goodbye for now. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I will see you all next time.